Hello, everybody. We are going to be going over Chapter 14 of Introduction to Psychology, and we're speaking about personality. So, after we go through this particular chapter, you will be able to discuss and understand the dynamics of Sigmund Freud, speaking about how his theory is and how the changes that he had to also make within him. We'll be going over the psychosexual stages as well as looking at defense mechanisms that will be toward anxiety. Then we're going to shift and look at Neo-Freudians, those individuals that initially started out with Freud but branched out and seeing things a little differently than he did and came up with their own theories. Individuals like Carl Jung, Alfred Adler. Then we're going to move on and we'll look at different learning approaches and some inconsistencies that are impacted through personality. And then we'll look at the humanistic approach in terms of personality and humanistic psychology. So, first and foremost, we want to know what is a personality, okay? Personality is consistent of being a stable, consistent ways in which a person's behavior may differ from others. It's something that may be unique to you, particularly within social situations. Now, most people have heard of Freud. We hear Freud, and there's so much that can come about from hearing Sigmund Freud's name. But just to make sure you have an understanding of who this person who kind of revolutionized psychology for a moment. And I will say that Freud, first and foremost, was more of the art of psychology rather than the science of psychology. And you'll understand why. But as I go on. But just to give you a little background information, Freud was a physician from Austria, and he came up with the psychoanalytic approach, which branches out later to psychodynamics. Okay, but it's through his theories that the psychodynamic theory came to be. And pretty much with the psychodynamic theory, as well as psychoanalytics, it's talking about how the personality interplays through conflicting forces, that being our unconscious ones that would be within a person. Those internal forces that we really don't understand, that how it pushes us and pulls us to making decisions and doing things and behave in particular ways. Now, Freud felt his theoretical orientation pretty much was trying to have an understanding about the human mind. And early in his career, Freud looked and worked with Joseph Breuer, who was also a psychiatrist, who was treating a young woman who demonstrated fluctuating physical complaints. She talked about her past with Breuer, and she was able to describe some traumatic emotional experiences. Breuer, and later then Freud, felt that these experiences, she recalled, was allowed her to produce a catharsis. And a catharsis is pretty much being able to release pent-up emotional tensions and conflicts that actually help to relieve the illness. But other scholars felt, after re-examining, the records, that the woman was also so central to the history of psychoanalysis that it showed little to no benefit from the treatment itself. Needless to say, whether or not catharsis had been successful in the case or in any other, Freud decided to start seeking out what we call the talking cure with other patients. And he referred to this method of being able to explain and deal with the personality. And based off that interplay of conscious and unconscious forces is the birth of psychoanalysis. So, central to his theory, Freud's concept of the unconscious is basically a repository of those memories, our emotions, as well as our thoughts, many of which would be deemed illogical according to Freud, in which it would affect our behavior even though we didn't even talk about them out loud. According to Freud's theory, people pretty much dealt with traumatic experiences and unresolved childhood conflicts by forcing certain thoughts and emotions back down into the unconscious. And so the goal for a psychoanalyst would be to help bring those memories back to consciousness, being able to produce catharsis, that release and gaining insight, and being able to have that person overcome any type of irrational impulses based upon those conflicts. So a psychoanalyst would listen really intently to everything that the patient would say and then try to help explore the meanings behind their thoughts and memories and actions. And the assumption is that by understanding and bringing those unconscious materials within the consciousness would be a psychological improvement overall. So just remember, catharsis is being able to release up that pent up energy. It's like, yeah, I got that off my chest and now I feel 10 times better. Psychoanalysis is the method that would help to bring the unconscious to the conscious, and that would include our thoughts and emotions. And of course, unconscious is those memories and emotions and thoughts. Many Freud felt that was illogical, that was deep down within, so to speak. We don't even realize that it exists. That's how deep down it is. Okay? So now, Freud initially attributed neurotic behavior to the recent traumatic experiences within his patients' lives. But the recent events often seemed insufficient for explanations. So early in the 1890s, Freud started attributing patients' problems more toward their sexual difficulties, and then he recommended that there be an increased sexual activity as a cure. And he was like, okay, you got some pent up sexual aggression going on. You need to let it loose, let it out, have a climactic experience, and you should start feeling better. That's pretty much what Freud was thinking. So he abandoned the idea and then suggested that the ultimate issue was more about sexual abuse during childhood. I always felt that Freud was pretty much projecting his own issues when he created this theory. But Freud's patients denied any kind of memories like that, and Freud started putting together parts of patients' dream reports or slips of the tongue, which we call today a Freudian slip. You ever have those moments where you say something that you wasn't thinking to say it, but it came out anyway? That's a Freudian slip, okay? But what he claimed was that they pointed to earlier sexual abuse. He then tried to persuade his patients to go read more into what he was trying to interpret as far as the material that they provided. Years later, he finally abandoned that emphasis on childhood sexual abuse. And according to Freud, he pretty much decided that his patients just misled him into believing they were sexually abused in early childhood. Again, I think a lot of it is sometimes we have to be careful of what we're hearing. Listening, active listening is an extremely important facet in psychology, in doing therapy. And I'm going to speculate that Freud might have heard what he wanted to hear, which I would say is a therapist biased, okay? But He did replace the idea about that early sexual abuse with theories that really focused now on more of a child's sexual fantasies. So, although he didn't fully develop those views of girls' early sexual development, he was more explicit about boys. And during early childhood, every boy goes through what is called the Oedipus complex. And here is where he developed a sexual interest toward the mother. The boy would become sexually or having a love relationship that would be more for a man and woman than a mother and son, according to Freud. And what it did was generate a competitive aggression toward the father. Freud felt that most boys would negotiate through this stage and then finally emerge with a healthy personality. But those who fail to resolve those sexual fantasies would then develop these long-term personality issues. So, what evidence did he have for this view in the first place? Again, he had nothing that most people would consider as evidence. Rather, he considered the same statements his patients made to him earlier and reinterpreted them. Just as his patients denied having been sexually abused in childhood, they kind of also denied his interferences about childhood sexual fantasies. Freud's main reason for his interpretation simply was that he could construct a coherent story that would link to the patient's symptoms, their dreams, and whatsoever in regards to sexual fantasies. And so Freud felt that that must have had happened then. Let me say, as a person, as a psychologist, my theoretical orientation is within psychodynamics. And although there are many who feel that Freud's work is nonsense, uh, I can say to you honestly that I do find merit in some of what Freud theory had. I do believe that there is things that's going on that we unconsciously pushed in ourselves. I do believe that we have conflicts that sometimes have occurred during our childhood, and the term being stuck is when you're not able to resolve those issues because sometimes you don't even know you had that issue, and how it would impact you as an adult. So in certain aspects, I do, being trained in psychodynamics, I have the understanding on where Freud was coming from. Do I agree wholeheartedly with what Freud was saying? No. And there was others who studied under him who also felt, okay, he started something. He was on the right track, but he wasn't quite there. One of the things with me in terms of my theoretical orientation, I actually utilize what we call eclectic, or they don't say that now, they call it more of a psychosocial model. Um, but what I've used is concepts of psychodynamics with what I like as reality therapy or choice theory. I think the two of them work well hand in hand, and pretty much as a therapist, that's the theoretical framework that I've used over the years. So, needless to say, is there merit to it? Yes. Is it 100%? As you know, I've said in the past, nothing is always 100%. But we'll talk about more about something, what came from Freud's work as I go on into the chapter. So, like I said, Freud, he felt that a lot of it had to do with our childhood, and pretty much he felt children that go through these different stages of what he called psychosexual development. And pretty much each leaves its mark on our personality when we become adults. So these stages here listed, I'm sorry, excuse me, these stages that's here listed starting with the oral stage, will begin at birth to around age 1.5 or 12, 12.5 months. And during this stage, an infant would derive intense pleasure from the stimulation from their mouth, okay, oral fixation, especially with the sucking of the mother's breast or the nipple. So, according to Freud, someone who's fixated at this stage would continue to receive great pleasure from eating, for example, or drinking, smoking, also having issues with dependence and independence. So more or less, if you make it through this stage unscathed, according to Freud, you would just be well-adjusted, independent, and if you don't make it and you're stuck at this stage, then what happens is that you have those oral fixations. You always have to have something. An individual that's dealing with obesity, or they have eating disorders, we may say that somewhere along the line they might have been deprived of the breast, or removed the bottle too early, or was kept on it too long. It could be that way too. So we look at those type of situations to see these conflicts and whether or not it's going to impact a person when they become an adult. Okay, so now around 1.5, now a child would be entering what we call the anal stage, and this is when the psychosexual pleasure would be actually sensations from bowel movements from the anus. And here's when toilet training becomes a key issue. So if toilet training is too strict, the child was chastised, degraded, or punished, then someone fixated at this stage would go through life holding back, not feeling confident, not allowing themselves to try to do things. When they're being orderly or stingy or stubborn, or go through the opposite extreme where they might be messy or wasteful. That means that, okay, there was something that happened that they got stuck in. Like I said, sometimes, a lot of parents would love to let go Pampers really early, so they try to start potty training at before even a year. And for some, they do get there to succeed, but for others, it's when, it doesn't happen right away. So those are the type of fixations and issues that can occur because of the anal stage. Now, let's talk about around age 3 when the phallic stage kicks in. Here, children will begin to start playing with their genitals, and pretty much Freud's belief was they'll become sexually attracted to the opposite parent. So if it's a boy, they're going to be attracted to their their mother, and we talked about that as the Oedipus complex. And then if it's the girl, there's going to be what we call the Electra complex, which the textbook really don't go much into in terms of female, which I kind of find that to be biased, but it would be called Electra. Okay, just remember, Freud felt that with every boy that has issues as far as with touching the penis, then they would have difficulties being close. He also felt that they would be afraid that they would have their penis cut off, but again, I felt that was some projecting going on Freud's behalf. But anyway, whereas the girls, they would develop penis envy. Sexist, yes. Freud definitely demonstrated that wholeheartedly. But think about the times he lived. So, moving on, around 5 or 6 years of age until we get to puberty or adolescence, this is when children would have what Freud called the latent period. in which they suppress now their psychosexual interests. And during this time, they play mostly with their peers of their own sex. To get in this stage, it's now moving toward puberty. Younger people are taking more stronger sexual interest in other people. This is going to be known now as the genital stage. And so people who successfully negotiated the earlier stages, they should be able to know primary satisfaction and would be gainfully wanting to enjoy and be content in having sexual intercourse. So it's just giving you a brief synopsis of the psychosexual development. When you take developmental psychology, you probably will get a whole lot more about Freud's psychosexual stages of development. But I just wanted to give you a little introduction. Now, let's talk about how the personality is constructed according to Freud. So here, Freud felt that it consisted of three aspects: the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, with the id, this is where sexual and biological drives and impulses are seeking to get immediate satisfaction and gratification. So think about when you say you run into a store, you're out window shopping with a friend, all of a sudden you see that special item and you just grab it and buy it. Even though you know you might have bills and other things looming and you really didn't have the money for it, your impulse driven you to get it. That's it, according to Freud. Whereas the ego, now the ego is the one that would provide you with help, hopefully, for decision making in terms of being rational. And that's that part of your personality. The ego would kind of try to tap on id's side, on shoulder, and say, hey, wait a minute. Did you think about your rent this week? Did you do this? You know. And then the superego. Now, the superego is the one that maintains rules, maintains the things we should do or what we shouldn't do, and how we learn from it. Some morality issues in terms of how our parents would be, or how we should be nice little boys or girls. And the three of them is what we call the tripartite, okay? They work hopefully hand in hand when you have a healthy personality. The id is going to be looking for that immediate gratification. The ego is going to be rational and try to help you to make the right decisions. The decisions that you would find appropriate. Call the ego to me as the executor, okay? And then the superego, basically the way to remember it is that it's going to help you as far as morality issues. All right, so now within psychodynamics, Freud came up with what he felt was ego's way of handling and dealing with conflicts in different situations, and particularly when it came to anxiety. Okay, the ego defends itself against anxiety by trying to regulate those unpleasant thoughts and impulses that will be within the unconscious. And so what happens is we develop a defense mechanism that the ego will release that should hopefully keep us to cope and deal with things. Now, some of these would be repression, denial, rationalization, displacement, regression, projection, reaction formation, and sublimation. Okay? Defense mechanism of repression is that motivator to be able to remove something from the unconscious. So we might repress those unacceptable, undesirable type of thoughts and feelings or memories. Like if you've had unacceptable situation in which you found yourself feeling guilty, we might repress those feelings. Freud maintained that people repress painful, traumatic memories. Repressed material would be removed from the consciousness into the unconscious, but it's not really forgotten. We just shoved it down, okay? And then the refusal to believe unpleasant information. This just can't be happening. That defense mechanism is called denial. It's where whereas repression helps to remove the information from our consciousness and put it into the unconsciousness, denial is pretty much saying that what you hear is not happening. That's not the case. I can give an example. I had a brother who was murdered, and when I got the phone call from my sister-in-law, I went into a complete state of denial. I called her a liar. I cursed her out. I said, why would you do something like that? Why would you call me and tell me such lies? What did I do to you? And it took me several hours to come into grips and cope with the reality. And more or less, that's what happens with denial. We're not ready to allow ourselves to hear the truth or the reality of a situation. So we resort to saying it's something that didn't happen. Okay? When people attempt to show that their actions are justifiable, that's rationalization. Okay? An example of that, say you wanted to go to the movies, and even though you got a test for the next day, more studying won't do me any good anyway, is what you might say to yourself. By diverting a behavior or thought away from its natural target toward a less threatening target is what we do when we're displacing. Okay? So people may engage in the behavior, and it helps in terms of not being so anxious anymore. So if you're angry with your employer or you're angry with Dr. Kearns-Cooper, you may yell at somebody else because you fear that retribution might occur if you yelled at me or yelled at your boss. So instead, you displace it and you throw it at the other person. Okay? That's displacement. Now, a return to being more immature or having an immature level of functioning is what we call regression. It's that effort to avoid the anxiety of a situation by being childish. And the person kind of returns to how they used to be when they were a teenager or a kid. They feel more secure, and it was a more easier time in life. So an example of that would be when there's an adult who just gone through a divorce or lost a job. They might move back in with their parents. That is when you're regressing. Okay? Now you heard me saying projection. Projection is attributing one's own undesirable characteristics to other people, and that's what projecting is. And I've said it throughout that I felt that Freud was projecting what he really didn't want to admit was his issues, and he created a theory from it. And that's my example of projection. So, now, in terms of reaction formation, when we're trying to avoid the awareness of some type of weakness we have, people may sometimes use reaction formation to kind of see themselves differently by being opposite of what they really are. Okay? So the way you could think of it, they go to the opposite extreme. If they actually is really snobbish, then all of a sudden they might be acting altruistic in front of others to try to appear that they care for other people, even though they might be more of a self-centered individual. Rather than show the self-centeredness, then they become more altruistic and wanting to help everybody. And it goes to the extremes. So That's what we would call reaction formation. Now, in terms of the transformation of sexual or aggressive energies into a culturally acceptable or even more admirable type behaviors is what sublimation is all about. According to Freud, sublimation lets someone express an impulse without being able to admit its existence. An example of this would be an artist painting and sculpting, and it represents the sublimation of sexual impulses. Okay, rather than show that they might be a sex addict, they become one of these prolific artists, and things that we appreciate and love is what they would give us, rather than showing that they rather be having sex all day long. Now that's Freud's work, but have to share it nonetheless. Now I mentioned in the beginning that a lot of Freud had a lot of students that followed his work initially. But psychologists who were known as Neo-Freudian is those who kept parts of Freud's theory, and what they did was they modified it to a certain extent. One of the most influential was a German-born physician named Karen Horney, and she kept the concept about repression, but she argued that penis envy in women was no more likely than womb envy in men. And not that she was a feminist, she just realized that, Freud's theory was really geared toward men being superior, females being inferior, based upon that penis envy. So, she also was arguing that women, they have the same drives to achieve like men do, and that women get frustrated when they're forced into subordinate roles, like, oh, the woman, she's a homemaker only, because you have to also think about the times this is occurring, that they were just homemakers and they weren't good for anything else. Okay, thankfully we know that stuff is changing, but in that way she was a forerunner of her time that helped feminist thinkers later on. And contrary to Freud's idea of an Oedipus complex, Horney emphasized the detrimental effects a child might feel from parental neglect or indifference. Okay. Horney also focused on what happens when someone's unrealistic view of the ideal self would contrast with a low evaluation of their real self, and the constant feeling that I should be better in so many ways kind of tyrannizes the person, leading to psychological distress. So in pronounced cases, the result was more of an emotional turbulence that was called neurosis. Years later, or a lot of psychotherapists rather, emphasizes the same idea. Carl Jung's theory of personality emphasizes people's search for spiritual meaning in life. And to contrast the Freud, who traced much of adult personality to those childhood events, rather Jung stressed more the possibility of personality changes within adulthood. He discussed how people would adopt a persona, like having a role play. And people try to make certain impressions while concealing parts of their true nature. So, here's a good way I can explain it. Growing up, my mother, she worked as a telephone operator, and she had myself and my sister, we worked along with her of one of her many jobs. She held several hats. Strong woman, rest in soul. But she taught us to have a telephone voice. okay? One in which I would have to lighten my voice, get out of my baritone sound, and I would actually say, "Good afternoon, Jackson State University. This is Dr. Kearns-Cooper." You see, it's different from what my regular voice would be. Well, think of that same way. Jung said we carry a persona. We present something other than who we truly are. That's what a persona would be. Okay. Jung also was impressed that many of his patients described dreams with no clear relation to anything that was set within their own lives, but instead similar to images that was common with myths, religions, different arts, different cultures throughout the world. And what he suggested was that these images actually came up from inborn aspects, innate aspects of human nature. So if you dream about a beetle, Jung may have felt that it related more to your dream to be important role for beetles played within human mythology, and that's going way back in the ancient Egyptians, for example. According to Jung, people have not only a conscious mind, but they have what we call a personal unconscious. And that personal unconsciousness is equivalent to Freud's unconscious, but it's also a collective unconscious mind he felt. And within the collective unconsciousness, this is presented at birth. It relates more to a cumulative type of experience from generations before. So whereas the conscious mind and the personal unconscious would vary from one person to another, the collective unconscious is going to be similar for nearly everybody, and that it contains what he called archetypes. And these are those vague images, or at least a predisposition of formed images that had always been part of our human experience. He felt this was evidenced by pointing out similarities within the art of cultures throughout the world, and as well as similarities within our myths and folklore. Okay. Another thing Jung was theory contributed to was the idea about psychological types. Jung felt that people personalities fell into distinct type categories like extroverted or introverted. And I mean, there's so much more. This is just giving you a little taste of Jung. But through his theories, a lot came about. And he was one of Freud's first followers that said, there's much more to it than the sexual abuse or sexual issues that you're claiming. And this is how I see it. Freud really didn't think much on any other level regarding spirituality or thinking that people could think beyond their genitals. Now, Alfred Adler came up with what we call individual psychology, that being the person looking at the person as whole rather than within parts. He founded a rival school of thought, being individual psychology, and he didn't mean psychology of the individual person, but instead he meant indivisible, that being a psychology of the person as a whole. And not just where, like Freud talking about the id, the ego, and the superego. Adler actually emphasized that there's an importance within our conscious that it has to be more goal directed. Okay, so according to Adler, everyone has a natural striving to be superior. We have that desire to seek out our personal excellence as well as our fulfillment. And each person adopts his or her own method to striving, to being able to understand people. We need to be able to understand their goal and their belief systems. Adler felt that when we seek out success or a feeling of superiority for ourselves alone would be unhealthy. The healthiest goal would be to seek success for a larger group, like your family, your community, our nation, or even better yet, humanity overall. So Adler thinks that people needs for one another means we have to have a social interest. We have to have solidarity. We have to identify with others that hopefully will lead to a constructive action that would say collectively as a whole, I'm a person who cares, love, and I'm compassionate about others. Okay? All right, so now let's talk about the learning approach. With the learning approach, here personality's emphasis is going to be about the ways in which we learn our social behaviors, the way we look at a situation one at a time. In terms of social behaviors, we learn vicariously through reinforcement and punishment. That is, we'll copy our behaviors that we found successful for other people, and then we're going to avoid behaviors that we've seen fail for others. Much of what we think and do that's part of our personality is actually going to be developed through modeling and imitation. That's according to the learning approach. And though the learning approach is more behavioral, not psychodynamic. Okay? And with behavioralists believes in action. They don't think too much about people's thoughts and feelings and emotions. A behavioralist feels that we learn and we react, and it's our actions that speaks louder than our thoughts and feelings. All right, so now let's talk about humanist. Okay, the humanistic psychology. And it's dealing with the consciousness values as well as abstract beliefs, and that's including our spiritual experiences. It's including those beliefs that people will live and die for. According to humanistic psychologists, personality really is going to depend on a person's belief and perceptions about the world they live in. If you believe that a particular experience was really meaningful to you, then that's what it was, highly meaningful. Humanistic psychology came out in the 50s and 60s as a protest against both behavioralism as well as psychoanalysis. Behavioralists as well as psychoanalysts often emphasize less noble aspects of people's thoughts and actions, whereas with the humanistic approach, it's seeing people more essentially as good and striving to achieve their best, their biggest potential. Also, behavioralism and psychoanalysis, despite their differences, they both assume determinism. Determinism is the belief that every behavior has a cause, as well as reductionism, the attempt to be able to explain behavior in terms of its component elements. With humanistic psychology, though, they do not try to explain behavior in terms of its parts or hidden causes. Rather, they'll claim that people are free to make a deliberate, conscious decision. Okay? So let's talk about one of the biggest names in humanistic psychology that when you're in training, you'll constantly hear about Carl Rogers and his tenets on unconditional positive regard. Rogers is considered one of the most influential humanistic psychologists and regarded human nature as basically good. According to Rogers, it is natural for people to strive toward excellence, it's just as a plant would grow from soil. And people evaluate themselves as well as their actions starting way back in childhood. We develop a self-concept, according to Rogers. an image of what we really are and an ideal self. And this image is what we would like for it to be. Rogers measured self-concept as well as ideal self by devising a method known as a Q-sort. He would hand someone a stack of cards containing statements like, I am honest and I am suspicious of others. And the person would then sort the statements into piles representing their true self or not true to them at all. Okay? And through that arrangement, this demonstrates a continuum from what most of what me to least true of me would be. Rogers then would provide an identical stack of cards and ask that person to sort them into two piles, true of my ideal self and not true of my ideal self. And in that manner, what he did was he did comparisons about someone's self-concept to his or her ideal self. So people would be able to perceive from discrepancy between the two that generally felt distress. Humanistic psychologists, they attempt to help people overcome their distress by improving the self-concept for that person or helping them to revise their ideal self. To be able to promote human welfare, Rogers maintained that people should relate to one another with unconditional positive regard, which means it's a complete, unqualified acceptance of another person as he or she is. And if you feel unconditional positive regard, then that means you might disapprove of someone's actions or intentions, but you would still accept and love that person for who they are. That is Rogers' humanistic approach. Now, Abraham Maslow, he also was a humanist, and he explained that most psychologists always try to concentrate on disorders within the personality and assume that personality is either going to be normal or worse than normal. Maslow, though, he insisted that personality can also be better than normal. He emphasized more about what we call self-actualization, that achievement of one's fullest potential. And the concept of self-actualization would be, you can compare it to Adler's concept for striving for superiority. But according to Maslow, people with a self-actualized or self-actualizing personality would demonstrate different type of characteristics. They'll have more of an accurate perception on reality, pretty much perceiving that the world is as it is and not as what they would like it to be. There's acceptance about uncertainty as well as ambiguity. Sometimes I get tongue twisted. You'll accept the ambiguous issues that goes on in life. Anyway, moving on. uh, he felt about independence, creativity, as well as spontaneity, that we all make our own decisions, even if others will disagree. We still have acceptance of ourselves as well as others. And that we'll be able to treat people with that unconditional positive regard without a problem. Now, a problem-centered outlook rather than a self-centered outlook is pretty much Maslow's theory. And we think about how to solve problems, not how to make ourselves look good. We try to enjoy life, okay? And a person who's self-actualizing would be more open to positive experiences, including those peak experiences when we feel truly fulfilled and content. You tend to have a good sense of humor. Now, and I do believe it's in these slides, but just in case it's not, Maslow works off of what we call hierarchy of needs. And basically starting from our basic needs and moving up this hierarchy is how you would work towards self-actualization. that including how we take care of ourselves, our survival basics, our sense and need of safety, that being making sure you have a roof over your head, the sense of belonging, being connected with others, and then knowing and seeing that you fulfill things in life. That's all leading yourself up to what he calls self-actualization. I want to mention before I do move on to the next module, one thing I hadn't mentioned about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. One thing for sure, he really didn't think much of anybody ever truly reaching it. Um, he said we strive toward it, but in regards to actually reaching it, he never felt that anybody truly did. And there's where some debate and controversy for his particular theory had from other theorists. They felt, well, if nobody reaches it, why talk about it? And how do we measure what one person feels is satisfaction for others? And what cultural issues have we looked at in it? The list can go on. But that was for humanistic, and that was for Maslow specifically. But now we're going to start talking about how we're going to distinguish the Nomothetic approach to the Idiographic approach, and looking at states and traits. We're going to take a look at self-esteem. We're going to look at the big five personality and look at different testing instruments that's utilized in psychology for personality. And then finally, we'll talk about roles of heredity, age, as well as culture in terms of our personalities. All right, so psychologists, we kind of study personalities in two ways. One is called the Nomothetic, and then there's the Idiographic type approaches. And so with the Nomothetic approach, it's looking at the broad general principles of personality that will be based on studies of groups of people. So an example might be, we might look at a Nomothetic statement that more extroverted people are more likely to introduce themselves to a stranger. In those in personality research would use the Nomothetic approach. Now, when we talk about Idiographic, now we're concentrating more on intensive studies of a person individually, looking at what makes someone special. An example here is, I, for example, might study someone for their goals, their moods, and their reactions. And the conclusions I might come up with would apply to that specific person and probably nobody else. Okay, so now talking about personality traits and states. Here, traits are personality characteristics that will persist over time, whereas states are more temporary tendencies in response to a particular situation. So an example might be, being nervous most of the time can be considered a trait, but right now we're dealing with the COVID-19 virus, and so we're afraid at this moment, and that can be considered a state. So according to the trait approach for personality, people will have consistent characteristics in their behaviors, okay? And the way someone acts in one situation would give us a clue or allow us to predict how that person might act in other situations. Personalities, though, is really going to be difficult to measure, and the problem is that measuring personality of that behavior really wouldn't be entirely consistent. We might have to carefully look at how it was measured before we actually can interpret or come to any conclusions. So again, trait approach to personality, we're looking at that consistent personality characteristics, and things that we have to deal with in terms of measurement would be that it's not going to always be accurate, particularly because of self-reports, because some people would want to present themselves as better than what they feel they are, or some people would just lie. It's a reality that we have to contend with. Some things that we see as a problem is particularly with self-esteem. And that's when we're trying to evaluate one's abilities, performance levels, and their feelings of self-worth. The difficulty when we're doing this with self-esteem depends on the situation and the time. And depending on questionnaire items, a person might appear to be with low self-esteem, but then they indicate they have big goals and dreams and everything that we would see for more satisfaction rather than less than. And again, sometimes people are modest and they don't want to appear better than everybody else, so they might hush it down a bit. All right, so now let me talk about the big five personality traits. Gordon Allport and H.S. Audebert, they went through the dictionary and they found around approximately 18,000 different words that would be used to describe personality. It's a lot of words, isn't it? And pretty much what they did then was they deleted from the list words that were merely evaluations, like nasty, and then terms referring to temporary states, like confused. The remaining list, they then looked for clusters of synonyms, such as affectionate, warm, and lovely, and kept only one of those items, those terms, within that category. When they found opposites like honest and dishonest, they also just kept one term. And so, through eliminations of those synonyms and antonyms, Raymond Cattell, he kind of came up with a list of 35 traits. Although none of the 35 personality traits Cattell identified were synonyms or antonyms of one another, more or less they overlapped. So psychologists looked for clusters of traits that would correlate strongly with one or another. But the correlation with the other clusters. Using the approach, researchers were able to find that what they call the big five personality traits, or five-factor model. Here we look at emotional stability, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, as well as openness to new experiences. And the case for the five traits would be one, each would correlate with many personality dimensions to which our language can be seen in a word. The second would be none of the traits correlates highly with any of the other four, so they're not measuring the same thing. Okay, and the big five personality traits has been widely used throughout. Okay, so now this table here on this slide is looking at that five-factor model of personality. So when we're talking about the emotional stability, this is that tendency to minimize unpleasant emotions. The opposite term would be neuroticism. And neuroticism will correlate positively with anxiety, hostility, self-consciousness, frequent conflicts with others, and many physical and mental illnesses. So, emotional stability correlates with self-control, good relations with others, as well as a healthy mental health. Extroversion would be that tendency to seek stimulation and to be able to enjoy the company of others. The opposite of that coin for extroversion is what we call introversion. Introversion is associated with warmth, being gregarious, assertive, impulsiveness, as well as a need to have excitement. Unpleasant side of extroversion would be increased chance of alcohol or substance abuse, as well as other risky behaviors. The pleasant side would be that extroverts tend to feel good and report having high life satisfaction. In terms of agreeableness, this is a tendency we're compassionate with others. It implies there's a concern for the welfare of other people and is closely related to Adler's concept about social interests. Here, people high in agreeableness trust other people and expect other people to trust them as well. They're more likely to have stable marriages, have stable employment, less likely to have any type of prejudices. Although I have to say, we all demonstrate prejudice in some way or fashion. Now, with conscientiousness, we're looking at the tendency here to show self-discipline, that we're dutiful, we strive for achievement as well as having high levels of competence. People high in conscientiousness will work hard as well as try to complete their task on time. They'll be more exercise, they'll eat healthier, they're going to act, in ways that's going to advance health and longevity of their lives. Then finally, openness. Openness is that experience or tendency to enjoy new intellectual experiences as well as new ideas. People that's high on this particular trait enjoy more arts and creativity. They love those different types of music genres. They're going to go into more deep, prolific type of films and books. Um, there'll be more enjoyment of meeting people who are totally different than what they're expecting, those unusual individuals, as well as those who explore new ideas and concepts. So that's the 5-factor model of personality. Now we're going to move in talking about heredity as well as the environment. And we've talked about the nature versus nurture debates, but let's now see how this all relates to one's personality. To measure the influences of heredity on human personality, a lot of the research kind of relied on studies of twins, as well as adopted children. Those studies indicated greater similarities in terms of extroversion between monozygotic, and we remember monozygotic means identical twins, than the dizygotic or fraternal twins. There's been research that demonstrated heredity, the hereditary component to neuroticism, conscientiousness, as well as other personality traits. But careful studies of the genome, and the genome is looking at all of those chromosomes, have demonstrated no real identifiable gene with a major effect on personality itself. So evidently there's a great many different genes that may influence our personality, and each in small ways combined with the environmental influences that we've experienced. Research suggests that personality of parents, their biological children, as well as their adopted children, and their results have been able to show that the biological relatives, that being siblings or parent and child, showed low positive correlations, and people that's related by adoption had close to zero. So the low correlations between adopted children and adopted parents would imply that children learn rather than little of the personality by imitating their parents. Additionally, to the role of genetics, much of the unshared environment, those special experiences that vary from person to person, would be involved within the family. Now let's take a look at personality influences determined by age, culture, and cohort. How will your personality change in the future? The older people get, the more slowly they'll change. One reason for that personality, it becomes more fixed as we get older. So usually we stay within our same environment, and we do the same things year after year, going into a routine. And although there are differences that would occur over age, it's not as large as what trends would be consistent. Now, there's one trend found in cultures throughout the world, and that's middle age intends to be more of a conscientious than with teenagers or in adolescence. And most people reach their peak of social vitality uh, and sensation seeking during adolescence or early adulthood. So, excuse me, when we are looking at this decline, it's a gradual one. And it goes in further as we become older. So it starts to slow down. Now, when we're comparing personality amongst other cultures or countries, research has relied on self-report, uh, in which it could prove to be difficult at times. And we discussed why self-report sometimes is not always 100% reliable. But when people have to rate themselves, they usually compare themselves to others within the country, and therefore their ratings are not necessarily a good gauge as to what the country would be as a whole. Also, people in some countries are going to more likely use extremes of a scale, whereas there are other countries that usually stay closer to the middle. So, self ratings from one country are not easily compared to those from another. And so, the best way to compare personalities across cultures would be to observe the actual behavior. Now, research has demonstrated that there's generational differences within the personality. Measurements of anxiety have gradually increased over the decades so that normal people now report anxiety levels that used to characterize people in mental hospitals. American adolescents today report more desire for wealth than those adolescents of the past. And while reporting, there's less intention to work hard. So we can see that there are these differences that do develop. And we have to also take into consideration sometimes of our life experiences and of the situations that occur that would raise levels of anxiety, particularly right now. Has it changed your personality? Were you once a carefree individual who was now taking things and becoming more careful or overly careful? You have some individuals who, like myself, was always concerned about germs, but is it do I allow that to manifest and change me because of the anxiety that has increased? So we have to keep a watch on ourselves in those terms, not to overly panic, so to speak, but to be able to work things out, and we work it out through problem solving by following the tenets that we should be following to keep ourselves safe. Now, compared to younger people, older people tend to be higher in the conscientiousness, in agreeableness, and emotional stability. You remember that big five factors that we talked about earlier? And they're somewhat lower with extroversion. Openness will to experience decreases with age in most countries. So you'll find yourself adventurous when you're young. You want to try new things. You might want to see the world. You might want to go hang out and party all the time. But as you get older and get settled in terms of where you are in your life as far as with your career, family, and so forth, you might not find yourself readily wanting to run across the world or do party every night type things. You'll see yourself changing in that dimension. And that's what they're talking about as far as being extroverted when young, you might be turning introverted when you're older. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about personality assessments. After we go over this module, hopefully you'll be able to explain through the testimonials we'll discuss how personality tests can be accurate, or it cannot be as a good as evidence depending on the instrument and depending on the person taking it. We'll talk about the MMPI as well as other instruments that allows us to understand a personality. And particularly we talk about the MMPI and how it's a great detector in terms of understanding when a person is not really being as accurate about themselves as we would like. So we'll look at difficulties being able to use personality tests in terms of looking at different psychological disorders and the problems that we might face in that, as well as looking at criminal profiling. All right, so people's tendency to accept personality test results. Psychological testing, it has to be done really carefully. In terms of psychometrics, this is a course that I also teach on a graduate level. And pretty much our goal is we want to be able to know whether a test is going to measure personality. We're not going to simply just ask people about their opinions. Psychologists, we need to be able to design tests that's going to carefully be able to determine and whether or not the personality will be presented, and we have to determine that through reliability and validity. Now, a standardized test is administered according to an explicit set of rules, and the results are going to be interpreted in a prescribed fashion based on norms that were set for the population that's being tested. So just remember, with the standardized test, it's that type of examination that we follow a specific set of rules with, and we utilize those rules in interpreting the results of the data. And we look at this information to help us to come to a score within a personality test that would be of either normal range, or if there's some atypical type of issues going on that might present for a disorder. Now, one of the personality tests that we utilize would be the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or otherwise known as the MMPI. And the MMPI is a widely used personality test. It consists of a series of true or false questions selected in an effort to be able to distinguish among the various personality types. Now, the MMPI was devised empirically, and what I mean by that, it's based on evidence rather than just a theory. The authors had wrote hundreds of questions that they thought might relate to a personality construct. And they put these questions to people with various psychological disorders, and then to group of hospital visitors who were assumed to be psychologically normal. So the researchers, they selected the items that most people in any clinical group would answer differently from most normal people. And there was an assumption, for example, that if your answers resembled those of people with depression, then there's a likelihood that you were depressed as well. Now, the MMPI, it includes scales for depression, paranoia, schizophrenia, as well as other areas and disorders. So some of the items on the MMPI, it really makes sense theoretically, but others do not. Now, the MMPI-2 is a modern version. To be able to bring the MMPI up to date, psychologists eliminated obsolete items and they add new ones to be able to deal with things like substance abuse, suicidal ideations, as well as other issues. They also removed most of the items that made little sense theoretically. Then it was standardized in that new MMPI-2 on a large representative sample of the U.S. population. Now, within that revision, there's been more revisions since then. And the MMPI-2-RF, that was published back in 2008. Here, this is a 338 item self-report measure that linked conceptually and empirically to the modern theories and models of psychopathology and personality. The MMPI-2-RF, like all the other MMPI instruments, have been created and used based upon the original construct of the MMPI. The designers of the MMPI and MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF, they made sure to keep items in place that was designed to identify if anyone was lying. So this is one of those tests that it asks so many questions, and the original MMPI was like 540 questions altogether. As mentioned, now it's down to 338 questions, but within that, there's going to be a series of questions that, depending on how you answered the first one, when you come to answer the next one, if you answer it where it's not going to kind of lining up, it allows us to know that there might be some fabrication involved. So this is one of the main, more common type of personality tests that has been used and utilized, and is definitely considered evidence-based because it has been standardized. Now, the Neo-Personality Inventory, which is known as the Neo-PIR, is that standard questionnaire that measures the five-factor model and provides a systematic assessment of the emotional, interpersonal, as well as experiential, attitudinal, and motivational styles. It's a detailed personality description that can be a valuable resource for a variety of different professionals. The Neo-PIR is more of a concise measure of the five major domains of personality, as well as the 6 traits or facets that define each domain. So altogether, the 5 domain scales, as well as 30 facet scales of the Neo-PIR, including the scales for the agreeableness and the conscientious domains, will facilitate a more comprehensive and detailed type of assessment of normal adult personality. And although the manual has been updated with the introduction of the Neo-PI3, understand that Neo-PIR norms and forms, they haven't changed within that revision. So it's intended mainly to be able to measure normal personality, and that's in contrast to the MMPI, which is really looking to identify clinical problems or psychopathology. Now, another type of personality test is the Myers-Briggs. And the Myers-Briggs type of indicator is a test of normal personality that's loosely based off of Carl Jung's theories. And unlike the MMPI, which gives people scores ranging continuously from 0 upward on each scale, the MBTI classifies people as types. And additionally, is being either extroverted or introverted, and each person will be classed as either sensing or intuitive, thinking or feeling, and judging or perceiving. So an example would be, you might be classified as introverted, intuitive, thinking, judging. You would have that full list. The test would identify a total of 16 personality types. So the MBTI is more popular like for businesses who are looking to describe the personalities of their employees than to most psychologists who they're skeptical of trying to divide people into those distinct type of categories. Now, Other ways that we might draw upon or test personality is based off of what we call projective techniques. And when we say projective techniques, well, have you ever seen, in a lot of shows they would have it when they have somebody playing a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they show these ink blot type of cards. Well, those ink blot type of cards is what we call the Rorschach, okay? That's what we consider to be a projective type of test. We also have the thematic apperception test, which allows for people to describe their concerns indirectly while they're talking, talking about some ambiguous type of stimuli. So more or less, it would be a picture of a situation, and then we would prompt and ask the person if they can describe what they see. They would be asked whether or not they can tell us what is happening right then, what do they think would happen in the near future, and what do they think will be happening in later, even further into the future. So the Rorschach, that's the most famous, most widely used, as well as the most controversial projective type of personality technique. And more or less with that Rorschach ink blot technique, it consists of 10 cards that has those abstract patterns. And what I would do if I was to be administering it to a person, I would hand them a card and ask them, what might this be? And so the assumption would be that you would describe what you see, and your answer relates in some way or another to your experiences, any concerns you might have, as well as your personality. And a lot of critics, they argue that the Rorschach seldom gives information that one couldn't obtain from any type of biographical reports or other sources, and sometimes gives a false impression. And they doubted really that the Rorschach is worth the bother of administering, and strongly insisted that no one should use it to make important decisions. Now, my orientation, again, my theoretical orientation is psychodynamics, and of course we like projective techniques. When I learned how to use the Rorschach, I was one of those skeptics in saying, this is not going to tell me anything about the person. I think it's a waste of time. Learned how to utilize it, and it is a process, and how to interpret and work through the whole thing. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of work. But when I utilized it for one of my clients, I discovered when I performed the test and then was doing interpretation of the results, that it picked up everything that the client had been presenting. It picked it up. It was able to assist and help me to confirm my diagnosis that I already had. So after that, I kind of went to it as a go-to because I did find it to be quite effective. So defenders of it insist that when the Rorschach is used properly, its validity can be compared to many of the other psychological tests. Now, for me, I use that, but I use that I would also use the MMPI. I might use that Neo-PIR. So you use it in conjunction. When we do psychological tests, we don't just merely do one test and say, yes, that's it. We kind of back things up, and we go based upon our clinical interviews, talking with the client, utilizing that personality test. And like I said, sometimes I might bring in, I like to do both projective type of test as well as an objective type of test. So the Rorschach is considered projective, and the MMPI is going to be considered objective, okay? Because it's a set of standardized questions that's measurable, whereas the Rorschach is really based off of everything the client says to me. Now, unfortunately, the other tests also will show only low to moderate validity. Now, in terms of the thematic apperception test, or we fondly call it the TAT or TAT, This is consistent of at least 31 pictures. So I would select a few cards to use with a given client, and the person, they're asked to kind of make up that story like I mentioned before, describing what the events led up to the scene, what's happening in the here and now, and what will be happening in the future, as I mentioned. So the assumption is that when you tell a story about someone in a drawing, you're probably identifying with that person, and so the story is going to really be more about yourself. And you may describe events and concerns that you'll have that you would normally be reluctant to discuss openly in the first place. So it gives us a vehicle, so to speak, to allow a client to share more about themselves, even though they might be resistant initially. The results of the TAT are useful for research purposes, although it's not going to be necessarily for making decisions about that individual. Okay? So again, it wouldn't be one of those tests that we would say can be a standalone type of instrument for diagnosing. Now, implicit personality tests. And of late, a lot of research has been done in terms of talking about the implicit personality test, because this here measures some aspect of your personality without your awareness. Okay, one example of an implicit association test is is when we're looking at affective priming paradigm. And when I say effective priming paradigm, here is going to be both measuring the delay of a person's response after presentation of some stimuli and how and what it would be for. Both the implicit association test as well as the effective priming paradigm would help to distinguish moderately well between groups who differ in their personality. However, at least at present, they're not really as accurate enough as we would like to say anything with confidence about a person. But again, this has become a trend, so to speak, because what I find is in a lot of doctoral programs, a lot of graduate students who are working on obtaining their doctorate have been doing a lot of implicit studies. Uh, you know, is it that underlying, particularly when it comes to prejudice and racism and so forth? It would help in determining. So I think the more research that is being done and being able to be replicated, more is going to help the implicit association test, because it's going to be more valid and prove to be more reliable if it is demonstrated to be consistent. Now, uses and misuses of personality tests. Personality tests are useful up to a certain point. But like I mentioned, we need to be aware of its limits, because with these tests, it's not entirely going to be accurate. A score that seems characteristic of a psychological disorder may occur, but also in many people that really doesn't have a disorder. Like if you are me, I always admit to saying I have a germophobia, but that doesn't mean I have OCD. Therefore, although the personality test provides really a good cue, I have to also look at the evidence beyond the test. Like I mentioned, I might do several different tests as well as include information provided to me by the client, include what I have seen through observation, and it's a compilation rather than simply just going on one strict construct. So once we've done that, we try to take all the different components and allow that to help us to draw a conclusion rather than simply just the personality test by itself. Now, personality test in action, criminal profiling. I know I've heard a lot of people talk about how they would like to go into the FBI and do what they seem like in the show Criminal Minds, which this was their final season after all these years. But criminal profiling is also considered and known to be behavioral investigative advice. This individual would attempt to infer something about a criminal from the crime itself. Okay, so criminal profiling is an application of personality testing, and it's the assumption that people who commit similar crimes have similar personalities or similar backgrounds. And then there's going to be some psychologists who try to aid police investigations by constructing a personality profile of the kind of person who may commit a certain crime. Research has demonstrated that the accuracy of criminal profiling is really not that high. Okay, so again, it's really based off of a lot of clinical judgment. That takes a lot of training, but it's to be used as a guide and not just say, well, this person definitely is fitting all the criteria, so I can diagnose them that way. We would definitely want to add more things on. All right, so guess what, people? We have gotten through chapter 14, and lo and behold, we'll only have one more chapter left before it's all said and done. Please make sure to complete the assignment that will be due on Friday. Okay. Of course, if you have any questions or concerns, I know some people last week kind of struggled with the vignette sections of the assignment because the questions were on top and then below it was the actual vignettes. What I'm going to ask of everybody, please read the whole thing first. Read everything before you start working on it, instead of just trying to answer that question right there, because that will allow you to see everything within the assignment, and then hopefully that'll help guide you to how to answer questions. Of course, if you're having difficulties completing the assignment, please make sure you contact me so that we can work out some ways and come up with some ideas on how you might be able to complete the assignments. As always, I want you to keep safe, keep following the standards of social distancing, keep the hygiene going, washing the hands, keep trying to avoid touching your face. And I struggle with that all the time because I'm dealing with an eye infection, so I'm constantly wanting to rub my eye. But I've been getting better, so it's not as prominent, and I don't dig anymore. But try your best to keep your hands from your face. Keep yourself at least 6 feet away from other individuals and having conversations. You want to make sure that you're not only keeping yourself safe, but those that's around you as well. Have a great week. And again, anytime you need to talk or need a question, feel free to send me a message in the inbox. Have a great one.